coming live to you from Greater Minnesota. Hi, I'm Sue Baker, your host. In Session gives you, the viewing audience, an opportunity to access those people that represent you in Washington. You may have questions, comments, concerns that you wish to share with them. The number you will need to call to access our operators here will appear at the bottom of your television screen throughout this next hour. The number is 1-800-726-3178, and operators are ready right now to begin taking your call. Joining us tonight from Fargo is Senator Paul Wellstone.
Hello.
And joining us in our studios in St. Paul, our Representative David Minge from the 2nd Congressional District and Representative Rod Grams from the 6th Congressional District.
Good evening, Sue.
I'd like to welcome each of you to the show this evening.
Thank you.
Okay, let's begin tonight by taking about 3 or 4 minutes. And Senator Wellstone, I'm going to begin with you. And I would like us to address what you believe are going to be critical issues that we are facing in 1994. Senator Wellstone.
Well, I mean, Sue, there are a lot of them, but I think at the top of the list is going to be health care as a very key domestic issue. I think we're going to have a historic debate, and I hope we will pass good health care reform. I think there's going to continue to be, and there must be a real strong emphasis on the economy and jobs and small business opportunities and opportunities for producers, and that includes farmers. We're now moving into the writing of the 1995 Farm Bill. And I also think that the whole question of education and children and opportunity is going to be very important. And finally, the whole issue of crime and people wanting to live in safe communities and safe neighborhoods is going to continue to be with us. And the reason it's going to continue to be with us is that there's no one action alone is going to solve that problem. I see more when it comes to what we're going to do about so many guns out there in the communities. I think there has to be a lot more when it comes to actual opportunities for people. And then finally, there has to be strong support for law enforcement. Now, I'm not talking about the world. I think we're going to have to watch carefully what happens in Russia. I think the world has to face up to the genocide that's taking place in Bosnia. And I mean, I think that we're going to have to continue to understand what our position is in the international community as well.
Okay, thank you, Senator Wellstone.
Sure, thank you.
Representative Minge, critical issues that are facing us in '94.
Paul has said, I think that health care is at the top of the list for the Clinton administration and for many people. And right along with it, we have the question of crime and how do we make people feel safe and secure in their homes and in their communities. There are a variety of crime bills that have come before Congress. Some have passed the Senate. There's this debate always between stricter enforcement, which I think everybody agrees with, and then gun control, which is very controversial, improvements in the court system, just a whole range of things that can be done. Moving on, I think that the deficit is something I would add to the list that Paul did not mention. There's this abiding concern. What are we going to do about the hundreds of billions of dollars of additional debt that we're piling up each year? And how are we ultimately going to address this? It's really a generational issue in many ways, this problem of the deficit. Something else which is important to me is trying to address disaster programs. We've just gone through national tragedy with flooding and so on in our part of the country, and I think it's time to step back and assess how have these disaster programs worked. And for me personally, I'll be spending a fair amount of time on that and on federal crop insurance. Finally, I'd like to add to the list congressional reform. We have campaign finance reform.
Absolutely.
Questions regarding lobbyists and their expenditures on behalf of or for the benefit of members of Congress, and a range of issues there. And I think that that's a very important issue that we're really going to have to come to grips with.
Okay, thank you, Representative Minge. Representative Grams, critical issues facing us.
I agree with Senator Wellstone and Representative Minge on the issues that they've outlined, and they are, of course, health care is going to be the #1 issue that's going to drive this Congress. Underneath all the other issues and other bills that we'll be debating and voting on, the undercurrent is going to be the driving force of some health care reform. And I agree with the Senator that I hope we come up with some decent health care reform. What I don't want to see is completely abandoning the system we have for something that's untried and untrue. because while we may agree on many of the issues, I think we might have some disagreement on how we accomplish those goals. As David mentioned too, and as the Senator mentioned, you know, the deficit, it's got to be the #1 concern as well. As we're going into this session, we've got to look for ways of curbing the debt, reducing the amount of money this government is spending before we pass on even larger and healthier debts to our children. That I don't think in good conscience that we can continue to do this. And as the others have pointed out, crime and education, welfare reform, both the President and the Republicans are working on health or welfare reform packages, congressional reform. So there's a host of things to keep us busy in the next year. But again, I think topping that list is going to be health care.
Okay, thank you so much. Let's begin then with our first question, and let's give this to Senator Wellstone. This question comes from Wilmer, and it says, what, if any, will be the immediate benefits in 1994 to the state of Minnesota now that the NAFTA agreement has passed?
That's a tough question for me to answer, Sue, because I think the verdict is yet in. I think that the case for NAFTA was that there would be export opportunities, and therefore for our export industries jobs would be created. Then there are those who argue the opposite, which is given not a level playing field, we may very well lose some of our jobs to Mexico. I think with agriculture, again, it's kind of a mixed picture. And so I think that if I had to guess, I would say, since the question is right away, I don't think there's going to be an immediate impact, pro or con, right away. I actually thought it was a bad agreement because I think we should have tied a trade agreement to respect for human rights and democracy. It's going to be over the next 4 or 5 years that we're going to start to see an effect, when we see the effect. And I hope the agreement will be successful, though I have real doubts as to whether it will be.
Okay. Representative Minge or Grams, do you care to respond to that question at all?
Well, I too have had misgivings about NAFTA, and although I voted against it at this point, I hope it's a success. I think that the debate and the agony that we went through in November, October of this year over NAFTA is behind us, and now we should move ahead as a nation and try to make that agreement successful. In terms of what we will see immediately, I did visit with someone today who said that they're looking at selling breeding stock in terms of hogs to Mexico, and they think that their ability to win this contract was in part due to the passage of the agreement. I visited some industries in Minnesota, and they're looking forward to expanded exports on a fairly short-term basis in Mexico. So we may see some limited economic activity of this type, but I think that the overall benefits that are apt to come will be realized over the years. In fact, we're talking about a 15-year period for reducing or eliminating most of the tariff barriers that affect agricultural products. So it's really a long-haul process, and I think that whether it is a significant watershed in terms of our trading opportunities with Mexico, or just another sort of a spot along the way, remains to be seen. Many people who watched the debate and the discussion last year have said, you know, both sides have made this agreement into a much larger issue than it really is, because we have had improving trade with Mexico for decades, and we expect that that's going to continue, NAFTA or no NAFTA, and I'm hopeful that it does continue, and that we have a positive economic partnership that we forge with our neighbor to the south.
Okay, thank you, Representative Minge. Representative Grams, comments
Sure.
at all?
I would just like to add that, you know, it's only been in effect now for 4 days, and as Dave mentioned, it's going to be phased in over 15 years, so we won't see any immediate impact. But I think what it does is begin to lay the groundwork. As Dave mentioned, some people are already asking or trying to put in bids for livestock, breeding stock for Mexico. I think we're going to see more shipment of crops, Minnesota goods and services, high technology, medical equipment. All these are going to be coming in the future, and the groundwork is now going to be laid for that. So I think it's a very important agreement. I think it was good that it was passed. I know the argument was over jobs. Those against it thought it was going to cost us jobs. I believed it was going to cost us jobs if we didn't pass it. And I just hope that now that the agreement is put to rest, and now that we're going to move ahead with it, that we can get to the business of not trading jobs across the border, but trading products. And I'd just like to add, I know the Senator said we should have tied this agreement to human rights, but human rights would not have improved the jobs picture for either the United States or Mexico. And I think what we have to look at is not really job loss, but maybe some job shifting. And we're not going to be losing jobs, I don't believe, because of NAFTA. We might see a shift in the job market, but we're not going to have a decline or a negative number of jobs in the United States because of NAFTA.
Well, Sue, just real quickly, I know we want to take questions, but actually it is linked. First of all, human rights and democracy are about the very values that we stand for as a nation, and I think we should tie that to our agreement. Second of all, it is tied to jobs, because if men and women in Mexico don't have the right to belong to a union, an independent union, can't seek redress of grievance for better wages or better jobs or for protection of the environment, then in fact some of our larger companies can go to Mexico because they don't have to live up to the same standards we have in our country. So human rights are quite connected to the job picture.
Okay, let's not get into another NAFTA debate. We
Okay,
have
all
a
right.
lot of questions already, and some of them are so good, and I do want to
All
cover
right.
as many as possible tonight, but thank you so much for your comments. This is for Representative Grams, and it's from Bloomington. What kind of health care coverage do congressmen have, and what does it cost them?
Well, right now, the health care coverage we have is the Federal Employees Health Benefit Package, and it's similar to a bill that I support in Congress as an alternative to health care reform, and that is called the Nichols-Stearns bill, and where the government makes a contribution to my health care, I make a contribution, and then I'm free to go buy the package or the plan, the health care plan that I think best suits my family and my needs. This is basically what the Nichols-Stearns bill is asking for. It's leaving the decision in the hands of the consumers. It's giving you more of a decision on what health care package you want and how you're going to pay for it, to manage your money, and also to make sure that you have the responsibility and not some bureaucrat in Washington or a health board or an alliance that's going to dictate to you what plan you're going to have, how much it's going to cost you, and who's going to administer it. On the exact cost, I'm not sure right now exactly what the cost is, so I apologize for that.
All right, thank you. Representative Minge, this comes from Ortonville. A farmer has a tax liability caused by financial problems. When the land was foreclosed and he had no tax deduction, so he ended up with a large liability. He got back into farming later on. He showed up to get his disaster payment, and the ASCS had sent this payment to the IRS. Are you aware of this happening, and is there any way to resolve some of these tax liabilities?
I have heard of this happening on occasion. I've not heard of this particular type of scenario, but generally the IRS reaching some of the program benefits that come from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I think that one problem that we have is that many people, like the gentleman from Ortonville, have inherited a farm, or they bought the farm many years ago and then they mortgaged it to help a son or a daughter out, quite often a son who's getting into farming himself. And farming has not been good, as we all know, and with the declining farm economy, that farm is then lost. And people are horrified to learn that in the process of losing the farm, they also have a tremendous tax liability that's generated, capital gains tax. And this, to me, is almost an unconscionable situation. And I'm working on some legislation. I've talked to Colin Peterson, who is a CPA from northwestern Minnesota, a member of Congress, and we're going to try to deal with this issue so that those people who are forced out of farming in this context are not also saddled with a tremendous tax liability that comes back to haunt them. And I think this gentleman from Ortonville's situation illustrates this. Now, a question of what to do about his specific situation right now, I would urge that he contact the IRS, and if he has a substantial tax liability that's still outstanding, that he attempt to negotiate a workout or a settlement with the IRS so that he can put this behind him or have it on a scheduled basis, and he can make plans for the future.
Okay.
But it's a real issue, a real problem.
All right, thank you. Senator Wellstone, question from St. Paul. Would you be willing to sponsor a bill for term limitations? Why or why not?
Well, it kind of goes back to David's point earlier about government ethics and campaign finance reform. That's an area that I've tried to take the lead on, both on gift ban and disclosure of amounts of money lobbyists spend. And then on campaign finance reform, I've just been pushing really hard, sometimes with success and sometimes without success, for trying to get the big money out of politics. I hate the way we finance campaigns. I think it's obscene. That's what I would like to do. That's what I would like to see happen. Then we wouldn't need term limitations because you'd have a level playing field. If, in fact, ultimately we do not pass this Congress a really good campaign finance reform that creates a level playing field with a fair chance for challengers as well as incumbents, then I would consider term limitation. not until then. Right now, I really push hard on these other areas. I've always said that I don't think term limitation is good public policy, and I've always said first go to campaign finance reform. But if we're never going to get serious about campaign finance reform, and I'm giving it all I have right now, and ethics, and we don't make the changes that I think are really significant, then I am going to have an open mind about term limitation. Whether I'll take the lead and introduce the bill, I guess if I really believe in it, I will. I usually am more than willing to introduce bills and fight hard for what I think is right.
Okay, thank you. Representative Grams, this question is addressed to you from Austin, and it says, what do you think is the relationship of personal responsibility and strong families to the issues of crime and AIDS?
Well, I think the big problems that we're facing in this country today, whether it's crime and other areas, is because of a breakdown, I think, in the families and the moral fabric of this country. And a lot of that I blame at the feet of the government, because of all the programs that we've instituted over the last 30, 40 years in this great effort of social architects to get rid of poverty and for the government to step into families and assume more responsibilities. I think, and we as a society have backed away and too many times have readily given up some of these responsibilities. I think that we've got to get back to the basics of some family values. We've got to get back to where are our values and the morals, fabrics in this country. I've introduced a bill called Family First, which wants to strengthen the families by offering a tax deduction or a tax credit of $500 per family. And this is a bill that's an alternative to the President's budget plan that was passed in August. And we have about 90 congressional co-sponsors. A companion bill is in the Senate, and it offers no tax increases. It offers a flexible freeze of 2% on spending. It provides, as I mentioned, a $500 credit per child. And in my district alone, the 6th District in Minnesota, it would equal about $80 million that would remain in the pockets of individuals and families for them to spend as they saw fit for either health care, education, food, shelter, whatever they thought was best for their family rather than for the government. And it also provides business incentives for businesses, $40 billion to help them expand and grow and produce new jobs, because what we need is more taxpayers and not higher taxes. So I think the family is the first level of government in this country. We have to strengthen the family, and until we do that, we're not going to be able to offer programs from Washington that is going to cure the crime problems or the poverty problems unless we get some respect back in our lives from the family and build it from the bottom up and not from Washington down.
Okay. I hear Senator Wellstone wanting to say something. Is that right?
Well, I didn't know whether or not you wanted to keep going with questions or not. I mean, I was just going to say to the congressman that a couple of points. One is, if you have a across-the-board cut, then you're also cutting into programs like childhood immunization programs or nutrition programs. Flexible
priorities have to be set in budgeting, and that's
well,
one thing Congress
I think
has
we
failed
should
to do.
Well, I think that's right. I agree with you, and that's why I think when it comes to Space Station and Super Collider and Star Wars and Stealth and a lot of the big energy projects, I don't think we need to do that. I think that is waste. But I think when it comes to investing in childhood immunization, in more for educational opportunities, more access to capital for small businesses, more investment in the economy and people, if anything, we need to do much more of that. That is my only point.
Paul, thank you.
I don't think so, but we'll get a chance to talk about that more.
We can debate that later as well. Representative Minge, a few weeks back, you talked a little bit about the U.S. Department of Agriculture doing some restructuring. Has any more been happening with this? And if there is going to be restructuring, there is concern in Holloway that this might have some adverse effects on the people out here who need and use their services.
Well, it's a pretty opportune time to raise this question. There will be a hearing of the Agricultural Committee in the House tomorrow in Fargo, North Dakota, on the restructuring proposal from the Clinton administration for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And I will be up in Fargo for that hearing tomorrow. In terms of how it will affect the delivery of services in Holloway or Swift County, Grant County, and other parts of Minnesota, it's hard to tell at this point. They have proposed that there be a farm service agency created that would combine Farmers Home Administration and the Agricultural Conservation and Stabilization Service, and also draw on some other more incidental programs. I do know that there's a great deal of concern that the county committee structure that we have for ASCS may not be as effective in giving farmers an avenue of appeal instead of a friendly hearing. if they are alleged to have violated farm programs or otherwise are unhappy with a farm program that ASCS administers. So there's some concern along that line. And I know that there are a number of people who are also worried about whether you can combine an agency which is federal civil service with one that is not civil service and have the same type of commitment and employee, I guess, structure that we have in the ASCS today. So whether this would affect delivery of service to this particular farming area or not, I can't say. I just know that the package is out there. We're going to be considering it, and it'll be debated in Congress in the coming months.
Okay, thank you so much. Senator Wellstone, question addressed to you from Stillwater. Why have you been outspoken against longer prison sentences and harder punishment for criminals?
I haven't been. It's pretty
okay,
easy.
that's pretty simple.
It's a pretty easy answer. I think the real point is that I just don't think that alone solves the problem. I mean, we had a whole bunch of amendments on the floor of the Senate, Sue, some of which I think were just blatant posturing that everybody knows are going to be taken out in conference committee. But when it comes to long, hard, stern sentences with certainty, when it comes to real strict law enforcement, I think community policing makes a great deal of sense. All that makes sense, along with, I think, some real strict measures to do something about some of the just craziness with guns. People don't need to have assault weapons, for example. But I also think the other part of the equation, and you can talk to any really strict, stern judge or sheriff or police chief, and I have talked to them in Minnesota, they will tell you that you also, with your young people, have to have real opportunities. I think that's one of the places where I disagree with people who just put the emphasis on the prisons and just put the emphasis on the long sentences. I don't think that deals with the problem. That's one part of it, but the other part of it is getting to the root of the problem. And I think what Rod said about values, what Ron Graham says about values makes a great deal of sense, and I think that's something that you can't do just through policy.
Okay, very good.
I'd
Thank
like
you.
to, I sort of wonder, that call came from Stillwater. Was there any indication of where in Stillwater the...
You know, I never thought about that. Good point. Okay, Representative Grams, I'm going to give this question to you, and it's from Appleton. It says, if Congress is so concerned with the deficit, and we hear this all of the time, why do they continue to accept the huge raises they receive every year?
Well, I'm glad to say I wasn't there when those raises were passed, Sue, and but they were passed and accepted by this Congress. We did, though, last year when we went into session, rejected any further. There were some automatic pay raises that were to go into effect last year, this year, and next year. I believe there was 3 years, but we eliminated those. But when we're looking at the deficit, I believe that is one of the major items or issues that we really have to address. And we had an opportunity to vote on Penny Kasich, which would have trimmed $90 billion over 5 years. This Congress failed to step up to the plate. It didn't have the heart or the will to cut that spending. If you're going to be realistic, you're going to have to look at about a $900 billion cut in spending over the next 8 years in order to balance this budget. And if we want a balanced budget, that is a much tougher decision to make. And if we've got a Congress that isn't going to address a $90 billion issue over 5 years, I don't think we've got a Congress that's going to seriously consider balancing the budget in the near future. And if we don't do that, I think we're just going to continue to add deficits on top of deficits that we're going to pass on to our children. And someday they're going to come up to us and wonder why we fell asleep on the watch. And I think it's going to be a grave disservice to our children and our grandchildren. We're not going to live long enough to pay this off, and they probably won't either.
Okay,
Sue,
let's wait
okay.
1 second here. I
Okay.
need to do a quick break.
Sure, let's go with
And
questions.
then we're
Sorry.
going to go back to deficit reduction, though, because I do have several questions on that topic.
Okay.
I need to tell the viewers who are watching on Metro Cable 6 that Catholic Focus has moved from 8:30 to 9 p.m. That's Catholic Focus in a new time slot beginning at 9 p.m. tonight. Thank you. Let's rejoin now our deficit reduction talk, and Senator Wellstone, you wanted to say.
A couple of things. One was when I was actually in the Senate, I think it was my first year, when we had the proposal to raise the Senate salaries commensurate with the House, and I voted against it. I think we should have voted against it, and I think if you don't like it and you vote against it, then you shouldn't take it. Sheila and I don't take it. We give that extra amount of money to battered women's shelters, which I think is important. But you know what? Even if you cut, we're talking about accumulation of over $4 trillion in debt. we're talking about annual budget deficits, which have now gone down from what, about 350 to about 200 billion. Even if you added up all of those cuts in salaries, you're still not really dealing with the deficit. And I would just say that I actually think that President Clinton deserves some credit for being the first president that stepped to the plate, and we actually now are seeing the budget deficits go down each year, not go up and up and up. What we do with health care and controlling costs will be critical as to whether or not we're going to continue with deficit reduction. My last point is, I agree. I do not think we should be reckless. I think that the interest on the debt robs us of our capacity to invest in ourselves. And I think when other representatives and senators talk about our children and generations, they're correct. But also remember that in addition to the future, there is the now. And there are lots of children without the opportunities, lots of communities that simply don't see anything ahead of them, which is tied to crime. And there's going to have to be some investment of resources right now for those children to have a chance. It is deplorable that close to a quarter of the children in this country are now growing up poor, many of whom have absolutely no hope whatsoever. Either we invest in our children when they're young, Sue, or we're going to pay the price later. High rates of illiteracy, high rates of dropout, high rates of chemical dependency, and high rates of crime. We can't kid ourselves.
Okay, Representative Minge, comments on these issues.
Well, I've taken a lead from Tim Penny. He's turned back the wage increase that is automatic each year, and my wife and I decided to do the same thing. I think that Rod is correct. This automatic pay increase is stopped. It does not go into effect now in 1994. In terms of the budget deficit and deficit reduction efforts, I think that we should also recognize that we have a person of real stature in Tim Penny here in Minnesota. He's worked hard on this. It's unfortunate he's chosen not to run again, but I have had the chance to work with him and a number of Republicans in this bipartisan effort, and it was a sad day when that failed in Congress. But I do know that there's a renewed effort to come back now in January and start again to re-examine the budget and see if there are not additional ways that we can work together, Democrats and Republicans together, to make cuts that are fair, and we're not asking one group of the population or one segment of society to bear an unfair share of that burden. It should be what we've called shared sacrifice.
Okay. Representative Minge, let's stay with you. This question is from Montevideo. First of all, and it's a two-part question. First of all, how did you vote on the $22 billion crime bill? Second of all, do you think money spent on this would be better spent helping to prevent crime instead?
Well, I don't believe the $22 billion crime bill has come before the House yet, and I'm not sure of everything that's in it.
Okay.
It's been in the Senate. One concern that I have with the $22 billion crime bill is that the federal government is being asked, maybe even volunteering, to pay much of the cost of additional law enforcement officers in local communities. I've observed that in many cases the federal government has a net worth which is less than our local townships. And we're not in any better shape in Washington to finance an expansion of some of these local services than the local communities are. In fact, we're in worse shape. So as much as I think that we need to have strong community-based policing, I think it's something that we have to challenge state and local government to look at as well. We have a $414 million surplus here in Minnesota, I've noticed. Now, in terms of how we might better spend the money, I do think that we have to look at what are the causes of crime, and we can't just throw money at crime. That doesn't work. But I also know that when young people are in despair, when they don't have a job, when the prospect of finding a job is dismal, they don't feel like they have a stake in society. And crime goes up in neighborhoods that are plagued by high unemployment. And I think that we have to focus on trying to make sure that our young people become productive, active members of our community, that they're full players in our economy, and do what we can to make sure our educational system is strong, and as Rod has said here this evening, that our families are strong, because in many cases I think it's a breakdown of the family structure that's also led to some of this crime. So trying to get at the root of those problems is important. We can't do it just as a government. It has to be something that comes from the heart. It has to become something that comes from within the communities as well, and it should be an effort where government, churches, families and so on join together and do what's necessary to reverse some of these unfortunate trends.
Okay, thank you, Representative Minge. Representative Grams, I have several questions here on the higher license fees for gun dealers. Would you please give your opinion? There are questions from Claremont, Clinton, Bloomington, Milan, Appleton, Minneapolis, concerned about the higher license fees for gun dealers. Is raising the fee for licensed gun dealers going to eliminate the gun problem or not?
I don't believe it will, and I think it's unfair, and I wouldn't support the measure. I know Secretary of Treasury Benson said that he hoped it would because he estimates that it would close as many as 200,000 small gun shops around the country, which would stem the tide of guns. But again, we got to go back to the basic problem of, are the guns committing the crime or are people committing the crime? And we can legislate all we want against inanimate objects, and we can raise the tax on ammunition by 10,000%, as I think Senator Moynihan has it's talked about, and we can do a lot of other things. The Brady bill, I always call that a feel-good bill because I don't think it's going to reduce crime. It's going to give people a false sense of security. And what do we do after about 3 years when the Brady bill does not reduce crime and if violent crime continues to go up? Do we go back and say, well, now we're going to have to start outlawing long-barrel rifles or other things? So I think, again, what we have to look at is where is the problem. It's not with a piece of metal. It's the problem with society. If you look at Israel, probably per capita has more weapons than any country in the world, yet their homicide rate is almost zero. And you look at this country and we're murdering 11,000 people a year in the United States by handguns or other weapons. So is it the guns? I don't believe that we can continue to try and infringe on the Second Amendment rights that we enjoy in this country in the hopes of reducing crime. I think we've got to look at other things, and I think as Senator Wellstone said, we have to get more serious on the crime by imposing the tougher penalties. We've got to enforce the laws that we have on the books today. We have to have a sure and swift punishment. If a gun is used in the commission of a crime, then that sentence should be held off to the side, and if there's a conviction, it should be imposed on top of that and not be allowed to be plea bargained away. So I think if we look at of ways of enforcing and imposing the laws we have today rather than blaming society for a bad childhood or a poverty or hard times. And we had those hard times in the 30s, and we didn't see the crime rate in the 30s during the Depression that we see today. There was many who were hopelessness feelings then as well. I think it's society that's getting out of control and not guns, and I think just by imposing another $600 on the licensing fees for gun shops is again just a futile attempt or a feel-good attempt at trying to reduce crime.
Okay, Senator Wellstone, comments on this issue.
Well, I don't know where to begin. I actually, let me begin by saying that I am not sure about the $600 license fee. I kind of worry that there will be some small dealers who really are absolutely legitimate, and that as a matter of fact, many of the people who get guns who shouldn't have guns don't get it through those dealers, and this is just, it may be in fact unfair. And I think that's my initial instinct to this proposal. Now, where I part company with Congressman Grams is, first of all, you know, I have to talk to law enforcement people, and I have to go with what they tell me. And with the Brady bill, which we've essentially had in Minnesota since about '76, they don't say it's the be-all or the end-all. They just say that it helps to have a 5-day, in our state 7-day waiting period, to make sure that someone with a history of violence is not able to purchase a handgun. They didn't say it was the end-all, but it's a helpful tool to them, and there is no one answer. When it comes to assault weapons, I don't think people need to have assault weapons, and when it comes to trying to be more stringent to begin to get some of these guns out of communities and out of our neighborhoods, we should do so. Always keep it in mind. No, people have a right people have a right to hunt. People have a right to use it for sportsmanship. But I'll tell you something, the mood in the country has changed and the mood in Minnesota has changed. And this sort of argument that it's not the inanimate machine, it's not the gun, it's the person. Well, I mean, it is the gun that somebody uses to kill you. I know, for example, in family violence, for many women, the difference between being abused and being dead is whether or not there's a gun in that home. So I think we do have to get very serious about it. It's not the be-all or end-all, but I do think you're going to see more legislation. The license one, I'm going to approach that with a critical perspective. Okay,
thank you. Representative Minge, did you want to comment on this issue, or should we go to the next one?
Well, I would agree that the $600 license fee sounds like it's punitive. It's not designed to simply cover the cost of administering a program, but instead it's an attempt to probably force a lot of people out of business or simply add to the cost of business operations. So I'm pretty skeptical about that. I think most of the other comments that have been made in response to this question by Rod Grams and Paul are ones that speak for themselves, and I won't try to repeat those.
Very good. I'm going to give you this next question then. It's from
Is this a reward for a short answer?
It's actually just they want a comment from you, and it's from Fergus Falls. It says, part of Clinton's 1,300-page proposed health care plan requires that employers pay 80% of the premium for employees' and dependents' health care. There are some small businesses that will lay off employees in order to be able to pay for this. Please comment on this issue.
Well, President Clinton's proposal has been dissected and criticized and analyzed, and I think that this is probably one of the most controversial aspects of his plan. I don't think that we should have a plan that lays an unfair burden on small business or businesses that have low margins and have a low average annual wage. And although I'm not here to try to defend all aspects of President Clinton's plan, I do think it bears noting that the 80% employer share has a cap of 3.9% of payroll for businesses with the lowest average annual wage. And I don't know if this individual in Fergus Falls is in a business that falls into that category, but if he or she is, the impact on the business would not be as great as some people have feared. On the other hand, I certainly recognize that there are going to be some costs to President Clinton's plan or to any plan that is comprehensive, and it's bound to have an effect in the economy, and it's bound to result in some businesses laying off some employees. It's just, I mean, you don't have something this massive without some dislocation, and that's something that troubles me greatly, because in rural Minnesota we do have a large number of small businesses. I mean, that's the dominant form of economic activity, and we don't have a lot of good paying jobs, so it hits us hard.
Okay, thank you. Representative Grams from Brooklyn Center for you. And this is addressed in the sense that it could be for either you or Senator Wellstone, but I'm going to give it to you, and it says, do you support some type of credit for private schools? The public schools are funded by taxes. There are many people who prefer a private school, and it's not fair to have to pay for both a private and a public school. Comment, please.
Okay, and I'll just keep this short, because I do favor what you would call vouchers for parents to decide where they want to send their children to school, whether it's to a private or a parochial school. Now, I don't advocate this in the hopes of gutting our public educational system, because I think we need a strong public school system. But I think when the parents disagree with either the curriculum that is going on there or the situation in the school, whether it's safety or crime or the curriculum, that they should have the right to decide where they want to send their child. And those dollars that they pay should be able to follow their child to whatever school they want to send them to. Now, President Clinton had that advantage when he was a young man to go to a private school. He has right now the privilege of sending his child to a private school in Washington, D.C. He did not send Chelsea to the D.C. school system. I enjoyed a private school for 8 years, a parochial school that I attended. And I think this was a great advantage, that parents should have that right to do that. And it wouldn't hurt to put a little competition into our public school system as well. And again, I'm stressing that I'm not doing this trying to gut public education. I think most families would say they would like to keep their children in neighborhood schools. But if there is a situation where the parent decides they would like to move their child to another school, those dollars should have the right to follow the child as well. And just a final comment, many people say, well, this is something that would only benefit the rich. Well, right now the rich can send their children to private schools. You can ask President Clinton. But for the poorest of the poor, if they had a voucher that would pay the tuition, they also could send their child to a school of their choice. So I would favor a voucher system for education.
Okay, thank you. Senator Wellstone, this is from Minneapolis. It's addressed to you, and it says, can you put restrictions on the CIA and try to curb some of the abuses of power that we're seeing?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that's going to happen soon is that the CIA budget is no longer going to be a quote black hole, and we're going We're going to have the right to finally know what the budget is, and we're going to have a right to sort out priorities and to hold the agency more accountable. I think that's coming. I think it's sort of was part of the Cold War. There's still, and I think right now it ought to be much more open and much more publicly accountable. And I think, frankly, the mood piece in the Congress is going in that direction. And you don't want me to respond to any of the other questions that were earlier. I'm tempted to, but I don't know how to do it in a hurry. Let's just keep letting people call in. It's so tempting when there is some honest disagreement to get right into it. But let's just keep going with callers. I don't want to thwart that.
All right, thank you. Representative Minge from DeGraff on welfare reform. Please address the possible 2-year limit on welfare benefits that's been talked about, and what else do you see happening, possibly by the way of welfare reform?
Well, I think the 2-year limit on welfare benefits is a good proposal. I don't think it should be an absolute rule. I think that we have many situations, blind, elderly, things such as this, where a 2-year rule doesn't make sense. Or we may have a situation where there is a woman and she's trying to continue her education and complete that, and there ought to be a plan that's developed, I think, for each family, so that there's a movement from welfare or public assistance off to self-supporting or self-sufficiency. In terms of other ideas that have come up, I think the one thing that has really hit me in looking at the public assistance system is the fact that there are other, so to speak, fringe benefits that accompany being on public assistance. And the most important is medical assistance, or Medicaid. And as long as that's there, it is a tremendous disincentive for people to move into self-sufficiency, because they lose that Medicaid or medical assistance benefit. And it's hard to replace that unless you find an employer with a very good health care plan. So as a consequence, I think that a part of health care reform is related to welfare reform, and we have to find a way to make sure that people have an incentive to leave public assistance and move into self-sufficiency without sacrificing some important elements such as health care coverage.
All right. Do either of the other two, either Senator Wellstone or Representative Grams, want to respond to anything with welfare reform?
Rod, you want to go first, and I'll follow you?
I'll just say that this is a top priority, I think, by the Clinton administration and by the Republicans. I think both parties know that there has to be something done, and this has got to be a bipartisan effort. And I hope that we do make some definite changes in the welfare system, make it more of a workfare system. And I think we do have to put limits. Welfare was never intended to be a way of life, but a helping hand to get people from point A to point B and to become self-sufficient again. And I think that it's many times unfair and many times an economic decision that if you're making $1,000 a month but can get more plus health benefits on welfare, you make that economic decision too attractive for people, and when they are forced into that in many times, they take welfare. And I just think that we need some real reform, and we can't penalize young people who are out working 1 or 2 or 3 jobs to try to get their education, but yet help somebody on welfare, say we'll take care of child care expenses, we'll take care of rent and food, and we'll pay tuition besides and help you get your education. I think there's some real disparity there too. So we want to help, we want to make sure that we have productive citizens in the society, but I think some real reform of the system is well needed. And again, like I say, I think both Republicans and Democrats are going to take this very serious in 1994.
Okay, Senator Wellstone.
Well, there's 2 welfare programs. There's the SSI, Supplementary Security Income, aged, disabled, and then the program that is the one that's always under attack is Aid to Families with Dependent Children. That's almost always single-parent women, and the vast majority, by definition, of recipients are children under the age of 18. I think there's a lot of fantasizing about this, because if we're serious about more workfare and less welfare, then this is what we would have to do, and Dave Minge actually alluded to this. You'd have to talk about literacy training for some people. You'd have to talk about child care. I mean, you can't ask a single parent to go to work with no child care at all unless it's usually she can afford it. In some cases, you'd be talking about job training as well. And then you can't just yank a health care benefit away, and David's not talking about that. Now, the last thing we're saying is after 2 years, if you find a job, or after 2 years, you may be off. My fear is that we won't do any of the first things I talked about, and we'll just say after 2 years, you're off. Who gets punished? Women and children. There isn't a welfare benefit in this country that's as high as the poverty level in any state in the United States of America. I have met very few welfare mothers. You can pick a few. I've met very few welfare mothers who wouldn't give anything to have a decent job. And all too often what happens is a single parent woman will go to a college or community college, vo-tech school, university, graduate, and look for a job, and still, David, you know, you talked about the paucity of jobs, can't find a job with a decent wage and decent health care benefits. So let's understand that this isn't a simple thing, and the last thing we want to do is get punitive, get degrading, and punish many women and children. By the way, some of these welfare mothers, this may be unpopular to say, I need to say it. There are welfare mothers who in fact are very productive right now. They're productive because they take care of children at home. They're productive because they're the ones in the public housing projects in some of the worst inner city ghettos in some of the worst cities that take their children to school, sometimes with gunfire, that take their children home, that are the ones that organize the other mothers to try and deal with the dope pushers. We never get that image of those people, but they do some amazing things as well. So let's be careful when we talk about welfare reform.
All right, very good. Excuse me. Representative Grams, this question is addressed to you. It's in regards to benefits for gay partners. It's from Brooklyn Park. What are your views on this subject?
Well, I disagree with it, and I can keep this very short because I don't think that we should be doing this because it's going to set up just so many areas of abuse. And while I don't discriminate against anybody's lifestyle or their choice of a sex partner, I do not think by any means that we should be encouraging this through offering benefits to these partners. So I would disagree with that and would vote against it.
All right, very good. Representative Minge from Montevideo. Farm programs, they have been the same for the last 60 years or so. They don't seem to be doing any good. What new direction would you suggest for the farm programs in 1994 and 1995?
Well, I'd like to see something happen in 1994. I'm afraid that it's already too late to implement something for this year. It'll be 1995 Farm Bill or Farm Program that we're talking about. In terms of what changes, what new direction would I like to see, one idea that I've talked to some people about is what's called two-tier pricing. It would try to follow along with what was called the Penny-Harkin Bill or Harkin-Penny Bill, where a certain level of production, let's say 50,000 bushels of corn, could be marketed in this country at a more favorable rate, and that any surplus above that would be sold at a world market price. I'm not sure that this is workable, but I would like to revisit this issue and talk to farmers, hold some hearings on it, and see if it can be worked out. Going beyond that, I plan to hold a series of meetings in southwestern Minnesota to try to find out from people involved in agriculture what type of farm program do they think will work. Because I must say that in talking to agricultural economists, to farmers, to government employees, everybody seems to be fed up with much of the farm program that we're trying to administer today. It's complex, it's expensive. It does not seem to be giving us the type of reasonable or adequate farm income that we have to have if our rural areas are going to survive. And it seems to me that we have to come up with something better.
Okay.
I don't have a magic solution. I wish I did.
Okay, Senator Wellstone.
I just have to jump in on this and not to debate, but just to echo what David said. I really have a lot of emotion about our agricultural policy or lack thereof. I just hated the 85 and 90 farm bills, and I feel like in the Midwest, this is where the historic battles are being fought. We're about the last part of the country where you have a family farm structure of agriculture. And I fear that if we don't get it right this time with the Farm Bill, what's going to happen to many other family farmers. And I would emphasize, you know, we talk about deficit reduction. It would be fine with me if we moved away from target prices and deficiency payments. Just give us a decent price in the marketplace by raising the loan rate. And I think that's in part what the Harkin-Gephardt, and I know Tim Penny and others supported it as well, bill was. David, there was huge opposition by corporate agriculture, and you know that, and I know that, and Rod probably knows that as well. But I'm telling you, we really need to do much better on that. We need to do much better in terms of price combined with sustainable agriculture. We need to do much better in terms of enabling young people. My son and daughter-in-law and granddaughter, they're trying to farm in Malacca, and you know, we visit them over Christmas, and boy, young people have, it's just so hard. You know, every day it's so difficult, and younger people should have a future, and I really think we're going to pay a dear price if we don't have a decent farm bill, and I think we're going to have to fight so hard for it, and I think it's going to be an historic battle, and somehow we have to win it.
All right, thank you. Senator Wellstone, let's stay with you. This is from Woodbury. What is your stand on drug legalization?
I wouldn't support drug legalization. I feel badly for the Surgeon General because I think her position was misunderstood. I think what she said was, look, the war against drugs, I'm sorry, is a disaster. She was saying, and we ought to look at other alternatives, and we at least ought to study whether or not we should treat part of the drug problem as a medical problem. I think that's what she was saying. She didn't say, I'm in favor of legalization today. She said we ought to at least study it and see whether there are other options. I think right now, if you were to ask me whether I would support legalization, I would say I would not support legalization. I don't think it would be a good thing. If you were to ask me whether or not we ought to at least study the feasibility of whether or not some of the drug problems are medical problems and some drug problems should be treated that way, I'd say of course that should be studied. And I think we got to do much better, by the way, in terms of health care when it comes to how we treat chemical dependency and what we're going to cover.
All right. Representative Grams, let's give this question to you. Why doesn't Congress or the Senate send fact-finding committees to Hong Kong, Singapore, Bangkok, or any of the Middle East sites to find out how they deal with criminals, because it's a known fact they have much less crime than what we do here in the United States? Comments?
Well, I don't know why we would send fact-finding, missions there. I suppose we could do that, but I think the basic thing is that they impose sure and swift punishment. China especially, if you're convicted of a murder or a capital punishment crime, once that conviction, you do have an appeal process that takes place as early as the next day. If you lose that appeal, the execution is imminent. So, I mean, they do not allow appeal after appeal after appeal. They don't put people on death row for 10 years, which in itself is cruel, unusual punishment for the prisoner involved. But I think we get back to just to the basics. If you're in some of the Middle Eastern countries, if you're caught stealing, you have your hand cut off. Now, that is very draconian in our standards, but again, it's sure and swift punishment, and you've got to realize that if you do the crime, that you're going to pay the consequences. In this country, so many times, for instance, the young man in Florida who murdered 2 tourists from a foreign tourist, he had been arrested 56 different times, and for crimes, and many of those had involved felonies with the use of a gun, and he was only 16 years old. So where is the sure and swift punishment that would have kept that young man off the streets, or at least put into his head that if he did the crime, that there would be some punitive damage? So I think if you look at the Middle Eastern countries or the Far East, you're going to see that the basic principle is less sure and swift punishment, and I think that's a concept that we've gotten away from.
All right.
There's a middle ground, I think, between.
Again, you can't continue to consult
but there's a middle ground between some egregious examples in our country and trying to pattern ourselves after a country that has, quote, swift and sure punishment, where people have no due process and where people can be summarily executed without, and we don't want to emulate countries like China, which violate the very basic due process guarantees and human rights of their citizens. So, I mean, there can be different definitions, but that's not the direction we want to go in. That would be my answer.
Okay, thank you. Let's take one last question. We have about 3 minutes left, and Senator Wellstone, let's stay with you. And basically a very short answer on what are your views on ethanol and what are you going to do to help get more support at the federal level for ethanol?
I think ethanol fits right into rural economic development. I think it's good for the environment. I think it's good for my state of Minnesota. I am delighted after what was a real struggle that we got an EPA ruling that I think we can live in with a 30% demand on the market. And I think that once we get a chance to prove ourselves in the market and once we're able to deal with the propaganda of the oil companies, we're going to make ethanol an important part of the energy future in our country. I'm really optimistic, but we got to stay vigilant and on top of this.
Okay, thank you. Representative
Sue,
Grams.
Just add to that,
Yes.
I just came from a meeting in Sibley County and Gaylord on ethanol, and we talked about the new Heartland plant that's proposed at Winthrop.
That's right.
I'd echo what Paul said. I think it's a tremendous opportunity for Minnesota agriculture, but we do have a proposed regulation which is designed to give us this reasonable market share, and we have to work hard to make sure that what's been proposed is not
It's real.
diluted or lost because of lobbying by the oil industry. So I think that we really, as an agricultural community, have to remain engaged with this, and the crucial decisions are have to be made in the next month or two. So
Absolutely.
I'd urge people to stay on top of this.
And Sue, I'd just like to end by saying I'm glad we can end this program agreeing on something, because I agree with
That's
the
why
Senator
we chose
and with
ethanol.
Representative Minge, because I think ethanol is an important part of Minnesota's future and our energy needs in this country. And I think it would be a big boost to farmers, it would be a big boost to Minnesota's economy, and it would be a great boost for this nation. So I agree wholeheartedly with the Senator and with Representative Minge.
Okay, and so all of you are agreeing right now that there are things that we can do as the public to make sure that we stay on top of the support of ethanol.
Absolutely.
Okay, and we should be writing to our congressmen and to our senators and letting them know how we feel about ethanol.
And
That we
equally
can
important,
agree
right
on.
to the
Okay.
Environmental Protection Agency in the White House. I think
Okay.
that that's where the decisions are being made. It's not in Congress on this
Carol
one.
Browner and
Okay.
EPA and the Vice President.
All
Al Gore.
right. I need to wrap it up this evening. This hour has gone very, very quickly. Again, I need to just do a quick break here. Metro Cable 6 viewers, Catholic Focus has moved from 8:30 to 9 p.m. That's in a new time slot beginning at 9 tonight. I want to thank my guests this evening, Senator Paul Wellstone, Representative David Minge, and Representative Rod Grams. It's been great. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I also want to thank you, the viewing audience, for participating in this program tonight. I do apologize that we did not get all of the questions that we have answered. We'll do our very best to answer those in future shows. We hope you can join us again next Tuesday evening for In Session, 8 o'clock p.m. Good evening.